Shepard. He and Michelle have come from Pensacola. Michelle's his daughter. His darling wife.
Is the teenagers going to stay in here?
Teenagers in here.
Okay.
His darling wife, Laverne, was coming, and somebody messed her up. That was me. I gave Michael the wrong date. He wrote it down, and thinking that was when he was coming, Laverne made sure she could get off that week. And then when I called him to confirm the meeting, we didn't agree on dates. And so he was gracious enough to change, and we thought Laverne could get hers changed. But she couldn't. I've already apologized to her personally. I did it yesterday. But you're going to hear some great lessons. And by the way, the group over here, if you can't see this, feel free to move over here for right now. Be no problem in doing that. But it's a joy to present to you from Pensacola, Florida, Brother Michael Shepard.
Thanks, Brother Wesley. It's a joy to be here. We got to move a little swiftly here. I want to speak to you and study with you this morning on the book of Romans. And of course, we're going to give you some data here, and we're going to use this board to try to keep this written on the tablets of your mind about this particular book. Now, the book of Romans, if you were to turn there is one basic thrust of the book of Romans, and that's God's righteousness, man's justification. We want to develop that. That's God's righteousness, that is man's justification. Now, what Paul does with this book, and I encourage you to listen very carefully, because the book of Romans, there is a certain methodology that you must study it if you want to get the context of the book. Now, in developing this theme, what Paul does, we will use at least 7 words to develop that given theme by their chapters. Now, when we talk about the book of Romans, chapters 1 through 3 have to be studied together. We will see in that chapter, that is the condemnation of man. The condemnation of man. Now, the first 14 verses of chapter 1, Paul deals with preparatory material. He expresses about the Romans how he felt about them. He longed to go over there to impart, or lay his hands on them, to impart some special gifts to them. Now, when we get to verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1, this is the process and the procedure that God uses to make man right with him. We're familiar with it. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's power unto salvation, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. For therein, that is in that gospel, that's what God uses to make man right with him. No other process, no other procedure, but the gospel of King Jesus the Christ. For therein, that is in that gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. It's written, the just shall live by faith. Now, we're not talking about God's righteousness. We're not talking about one of God's attributes. We're talking about the process and the procedure that God uses to make man right with him. And that's only franchised in the gospel of King Jesus the Christ. Now, beginning with verse 18 forward, you will see how the Apostle Paul now addresses the Gentile world. He addresses the Gentile world, talking about the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. He goes on down in verse 28 through 31 to list those 23 categorized groups of sin, and he categorized the Gentile world there. Then in chapter 2, we see the Apostle Paul address not only the Gentiles in chapter 1, but now he addressed that Jewish economy there, the Jewish nation, and shows how they are under condemnation. Then he goes to chapter 3 and he says, all have sinned. So chapter 1, Gentiles. Chapter 2, Jews. Chapter 3, all have sinned. He lists that the condemnation of man. Then when we study, now these 3 chapters must be studied together in order to get the context of the book. Now the next section that the Apostle Paul addresses is chapters 4 and 5. And that is the need of justification. The need of this justification. And the way that the Apostle Paul addresses that, not only he gives them the data, but he used illustrations using David and using Abraham to show this particular need of justification. Chapters 4 and chapter 5 must be studied together in order to get the context of the overriding thought in this particular section. Then, in chapter 6 and 7, chapter 6 and 7, now we see the results. We see the results of this justification, and we tag that sanctification. And the reason why is because in chapter 6 and 7, these are the results when a man is justified. That is, obeying the gospel of King Jesus Christ. This is how he must live. You remember how the Apostle Paul starts off in Romans 6 forward. He starts off, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning that grace may abound? God forbid. May it not be so. How that we that are dead to sin live any longer therein. No, you're not that so many of us as were baptized into King Jesus the Christ, but baptized into his death. Therefore we are buried with Christ by baptism in the death, that like as Jesus Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should also walk in newness of life. For we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we should be also in the likeness of his resurrection. So now we have the results of this justification, and that is sanctification, set aside for the purpose of God's use in Christianity. Now, Paul does something real particular here in this book of Romans, because he takes chapter number 8. He sets chapter number 8 aside from the whole entire book. Chapter 8 is set aside from the whole entire book. And what we see what Paul does in chapter 8, he sees this is called, this can be tagged glorification. And what it does here, it shows the rewards and of course the benefits of a person being justified. Paul takes chapter 8 and tries to encourage these Jews here what they will have in obeying Christ. You are not losing anything by obeying King Jesus the Christ. And Paul takes Romans chapter 8 to do that. He starts off with those 9 paragraphs up under the language in Romans chapter 8. He starts off with verses 1 through 4. And he shows these Jews that obeying the gospel of being justified, now you are not under condemnation. That is, the Christian life is a great life, because there is therefore now no condemnation to them who walk not after the flesh, but after the word of Almighty God. Then, not only in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 8, then he does something in verses 5 through verse 13. Verses 5 through verse 13, the Apostle Paul, he encouraged the Jews by saying, in verses 5 through verse number 13, this is what you have. The Christian life is a walk of life and a walk of peace. He uses these verses to illustrate that given point. All chapter 8 is encouraging them that you are not losing anything in obeying King Jesus the Christ. You got to come up out of that system. You got to turn loose that Jewish